The air in the Harrington estate carried the scent of lilies, though nothing about the funeral felt alive. The grand halls were dressed in black drapes, chandeliers dimmed to mimic mourning, and the echo of footsteps sounded heavier than usual. Alexandra Harrington, just 22, stood at the far end of the room, her black dress clinging to her trembling frame. She had not only lost her father, Richard Harrington, the man who had been her anchor, mentor, and the only true family she had left, but also the last shield protecting her from the venom of the woman standing at the center of attention. Beside the casket, her stepmother, Evelyn, shed crocodile tears with practiced grace, her veil slipping just enough to reveal a smile that didn't belong to grief. Alexandra's chest burned as she realized she was no longer the cherished daughter of a titan. She was prey in the lion's den. The days following the burial blurred into one cruel nightmare. Legal documents appeared overnight, all stamped, signed, and sealed, each one stripping Alexandra of everything her father had promised her. The estate, the fortune, even the mansion she had grown up in, all transferred to Evelyn, as though Alexandra had never existed. Alexandra stormed into her father's study, desperate for proof, for anything that showed his real intentions, but every file had vanished, replaced with carefully curated lies. When she confronted Evelyn, her stepmother's voice was like silk hiding steel. "You are young, foolish, and unfit to handle what your father built. Consider this mercy, child. Leave with your dignity intact, before I take that too." With a smirk, Evelyn had Alexandra thrown out into the cold rain. No suitcase, no savings, no home, just betrayal echoing louder than the thunder above. That night, Alexandra sat on the cracked sidewalk outside the mansion gates, her heart tearing apart as the estate lights flickered behind her. The only family she knew had been stolen, and the world offered no hand of comfort. She tasted salt, not from rain, but from the tears that would not stop falling. Yet deep in her soul, through the storm of despair, a single ember refused to die. As she wrapped her arms around herself, shivering and alone, Alexandra swore silently to her father's memory. "This is not the end. One day I will return. One day I will rise from this ruin, and everything you stole will be mine again." The vow was buried deep within her broken heart, but it would grow, watered by pain, sharpened by time, and ignited by rage. And when that day came, Evelyn would finally know what it meant to be dethroned. The city that once felt like a playground for Alexandra now seemed merciless and cold. With no money, no allies, and only the clothes she wore at her father's funeral, she wandered aimlessly through streets that buzzed with indifferent life. Every familiar place mocked her. The boutiques her stepmother frequented, the restaurants her father once took her to, even the art gallery where she had first dreamt of her own future. All now belonged to a world she no longer had access to. Nights were spent on park benches, wrapped in fear as much as in the thin jacket she clutched around herself. Hunger gnawed at her until it became part of her body, a dull ache that shadowed every step. For the first time in her life, Alexandra felt invisible, stripped of her name, her legacy, and her worth. The world had cast her out, and Evelyn's victory tasted like ash in her mouth. Days bled into weeks, and Alexandra learned the cruelty of survival. She begged in alleyways, scavenged leftovers from trash bins, and endured sneers from people who had once bowed in respect when her family name was spoken. Her pride shattered piece by piece, but beneath the ruin something harder began to form: resilience. She found work in dingy diners and faceless warehouses, jobs that barely paid but taught her discipline and endurance. The girl who once lived on marble floors and dined from crystal plates now scrubbed grease from tables, carried boxes that bent her back, and endured insults that cut deeper than knives. And yet she endured. Each day was a battle, but each night she whispered her vow again. "This pain is temporary. I will not be broken. I will rise." In her suffering, Alexandra began to discover a strength Evelyn had never accounted for. Still, even the strongest can falter. One bitter winter evening, Alexandra collapsed on a street corner, her body too weak to carry her another step. As the snow fell over her trembling frame, She felt the temptation to surrender, to let the cold claim her. But as her eyes fluttered closed, she remembered her father's voice, warm, commanding, unwavering. "Alexandra, never bow to the storm. You were born to lead it." The memory jolted her awake. She rose shakily, dragging herself into the warmth of a church shelter nearby. It was there, among broken strangers and discarded souls, that Alexandra found her first glimpse of hope. The shelter's walls carried whispers of survival, of people who had lost everything but built themselves anew. And in their stories, Alexandra saw her path. She would not remain a victim. This exile would forge her into something greater, sharper, unstoppable. The war for her legacy had only just begun. Alexandra awoke one dawn to the muted bells of the shelter, their chime breaking through the haze of exhaustion. For the first time in months, she felt a strange steadiness in her chest, as though the storm within had begun to take shape. She realized then that grief had nearly destroyed her, but it had also carved out something raw and unshakable. She was no longer the pampered heiress her stepmother had mocked. She was a survivor. With her hair tied back and a fire burning quietly in her eyes, she began to plan. She sought knowledge where others sought pity, spending evenings in the shelter's library corner, hunched over worn books on business, finance, and leadership. Every page she turned felt like a weapon added to her arsenal. Every night of study a step closer to reclaiming her destiny. While others slept, Alexandra armed herself with wisdom, determined that when the time came, she would not just fight Evelyn. She would crush her. Work became more than survival. It became training. At the diner, she studied the habits of the wealthy patrons who still strutted in as if the world were theirs. She listened carefully to conversations about investments, markets, and industries, piecing together lessons they never knew they were teaching her. At the warehouse, she observed leadership in its rawest form. The weak managers who crumbled under pressure, and the rare few who commanded respect through discipline and vision. She absorbed it all like a sponge, filing away each observation for the empire she would one day rebuild. Every insult endured, every long hour spent sweating and straining, became fuel for the fire that burned within her. Alexandra's body toughened, her mind sharpened, and her will hardened into steel. Slowly, the helpless girl who had once been thrown out into the rain was dying, replaced by a woman forged in hardship and hunger. But fate, as always, played its cruel games. One night, while leaving her shift, Alexandra saw Evelyn's face plastered across the giant screens of Times Square. Smiling, radiant, draped in diamonds, Evelyn was celebrating yet another expansion of the Harrington Empire. The crowd cheered, oblivious to the venom behind that smile, and Alexandra's stomach churned with fury. Yet instead of despair, she felt something different: clarity. Watching her stepmother bask in stolen glory only solidified her vow. She would not rush back into battle unprepared, for vengeance without power was suicide. No, Alexandra would bide her time, grow in silence, and rise like a storm no one expected. As the screen flickered and Evelyn's image dissolved into commercials, Alexandra whispered under her breath, her voice trembling with both rage and resolve. "Enjoy your throne while it lasts, Evelyn. When I return, it will be to tear it from beneath you." And in that moment, the first ember of her rebirth ignited into flame. Years slipped by like shadows, each one carrying Alexandra further from the girl who had once been broken at her stepmother's gates. By now, her days of hunger and despair had carved her into a woman of poise and quiet strength. At 26, she no longer looked like the discarded daughter of a fallen titan, but rather like a storm contained in human form. She had saved every dollar from her menial jobs, living sparingly, investing carefully in small ventures others dismissed as insignificant. Street vendors, struggling boutiques, even failing corner stores. She poured herself into them, guiding their growth with the instincts her father had once praised. Slowly, coin by coin, she built a foundation. What Evelyn didn't know was that the girl she had thrown into the gutter had risen to become a silent architect of enterprises scattered across the city. Alexandra was no longer powerless. She was a shadow building her reach brick by brick. It was during this climb that Alexandra met Marcus Hayes, a man whose reputation was as sharp as the steel towers he financed. Marcus was a venture capitalist known for turning ruins into gold, and when Alexandra boldly approached him with her portfolio, stitched together from her small but successful ventures, he raised an eyebrow not out of skepticism, but intrigue. "You've done all this alone?" he asked, his deep voice carrying the weight of disbelief. Alexandra didn't flinch. She told him her story, not the details of Evelyn, not yet, but enough of her fall and rise to earn his respect. Marcus saw in her what others overlooked, a mind honed by survival, a will that could not be broken. Under his mentorship, Alexandra learned the higher games of finance, investments that dealt not in hundreds but in millions. With every lesson, she sharpened her weapons further, stepping closer to the day she would take back her throne. But Alexandra knew allies were not enough. Loyalty had to be earned, not bought. So she built her circle not with sycophants, but with people as hungry as she once was. Former shelter mates who had clawed their way into skilled trades, waitresses who dreamed bigger than diners, even a disillusioned lawyer who had once worked for Evelyn herself. Alexandra gathered them not as servants but as partners. Together, they became her foundation, a family forged not by blood but by shared scars. Around dimly lit tables and whispered plans, they spoke of building something greater than Evelyn's hollow empire. Alexandra no longer dreamed only of revenge. She dreamed of creating a legacy stronger than greed, a kingdom where no one could be discarded as she once had been. Yet beneath her vision burned that unquenchable flame of vengeance, and she carried it like a dagger in her heart. For Alexandra Harrington was not merely building power, she was preparing for war. Evelyn Harrington sat at the top of her empire like a queen unchallenged. But power is never as invincible as it appears. Beneath the polished boardrooms and grand parties, Alexandra began to weave her silent strikes. She started small, targeting Evelyn's weaker investments, the ones her stepmother barely noticed but that fed into larger chains of influence. A failing textile mill here, a struggling tech startup there. Alexandra bought them quietly, restructured them with ruthless efficiency, and turned them into sparks of profit. Each success was another thread pulled from Evelyn's grand tapestry, though Evelyn, arrogant in her dominance, dismissed the small losses as accidents in the marketplace. What she didn't realize was that the ghost of the girl she had cast aside was dismantling her from the shadows. Each acquisition wasn't just profit. It was Alexandra's declaration of war, whispered into the very foundations of Evelyn's kingdom. Soon the whispers spread. Investors began to murmur of a rising figure in the city, a young woman whose ventures were oddly precise, whose strategies cut through markets like a blade. Competitors who had once cowered before Evelyn now found themselves courted by this mysterious rival. Evelyn's phone rang more often with news of defections, of opportunities slipping through her fingers. The Harrington name still carried weight, but its grip was loosening, and Evelyn's temper grew as cracks began to show in her polished facade. Behind closed doors, she lashed out at her board members, accusing them of incompetence, unaware that Alexandra had planted her influence even among them. For every loyalist Evelyn had, Alexandra gained two more, binding them not with empty promises but with vision, integrity, and the loyalty of someone who had walked through fire and survived. Evelyn was still queen, yes, but her throne had begun to tremble. And yet Alexandra was careful. She knew a war declared too soon could destroy everything she had built. So she played the role of phantom, never revealing her face, never allowing Evelyn to see the hand that pulled the strings. She watched from the sidelines as Evelyn grew restless, paranoid, her once celebrated charm fraying under the strain of unseen opposition. In the silence of her modest apartment, Alexandra mapped her next moves with precision. Her allies gathered around her, each one a soldier in a battle not yet seen. Every night, she whispered the same words before she closed her eyes. Not yet, but soon. The girl who had once been cast into the rain was now a storm hovering at the horizon, ready to strike. Evelyn Harrington had stolen everything once, but she would soon learn the truth of Alexandra's vow. Nothing built on betrayal can last forever. Evelyn Harrington had always prided herself on control. Control over the boardroom, control over her image, control over the legacy she had stolen. But lately, control had begun to slip through her fingers like sand. Contracts fell through without warning. Trusted partners suddenly withdrew, and once loyal allies began to look at her with hesitation in their eyes. She dismissed it as bad luck at first, but bad luck does not strike with such precision. Something or someone was dismantling her empire piece by piece, and the thought gnawed at her in restless nights. One evening, after another failed negotiation left her boardroom simmering with unease, Evelyn stared into the mirror in her penthouse suite. The face staring back at her was still beautiful, still polished with wealth, but the lines of age and paranoia had begun to creep in. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt something she had thought herself immune to: fear. That fear deepened when the whispers reached her ears of a mysterious young woman rising in the shadows, carving an empire with ruthless precision and charisma that drew others like moths to flame. Evelyn demanded names, faces, evidence, but all she found were fragments, rumors, and silence. The city had begun to speak of this rising star with reverence, yet no one dared connect the dots aloud. And then, one night, at a gala Evelyn attended to remind the city of her power, the whispers took shape. Across the ballroom, standing in a gown of midnight silk, was Alexandra Harrington. No longer the broken girl Evelyn had cast into the rain, but a woman radiant with strength, confidence, and command. Their eyes met across the hall, and Evelyn's heart lurched. The ghost of her past had returned, not as a beggar, but as a rival. Alexandra did not approach, did not bow. She only offered the faintest smile, sharp and cold, before turning away. That smile was enough to send shivers down Evelyn's spine. From that moment, Evelyn knew the storm was no rumor. It was Alexandra. Rage burned hotter than fear in her veins, but beneath it lingered a cruel irony. She had underestimated the girl once, believing weakness would swallow her whole. Now she saw the result of her cruelty. She had not destroyed Alexandra. She had created her. Evelyn returned home that night, pacing her study with clenched fists, whispering to herself that she would crush this defiance before it spread. But no matter how she tried to strategize, Alexandra's face haunted her thoughts. The girl she had once dismissed had become her greatest threat, and Evelyn knew she could not afford to falter. War was no longer a distant possibility. It had come to her doorstep, and this time, the battleground was not only wealth and power, but legacy itself. The city awoke to headlines that shook its financial core. Harrington Industries, once unshakable, had suffered its largest quarterly loss in decades. Stock prices tumbled, investors whispered, and the empire Evelyn had clutched so tightly began to fracture under the weight of a rival whose face could no longer be ignored. Alexandra had stepped into the light. With carefully timed acquisitions and alliances, she had not only matched Evelyn's influence in certain sectors, she had surpassed it. News outlets now ran stories of the lost heiress turned mogul, her face gracing magazine covers as the embodiment of resilience and power. For every interview Evelyn gave, defending her legacy with venom, Alexandra countered with calm, eloquent speeches about integrity, vision, and honor. The public, hungry for a story of redemption, sided with Alexandra. Evelyn was no longer the celebrated queen. She was the tyrant, exposed by the return of the rightful heir. But war fought in the open was bloodier than Alexandra had imagined. Evelyn struck back with every weapon at her disposal. Smear campaigns filled tabloids, accusing Alexandra of fraud, manipulation, even betrayal of her father's memory. Old acquaintances were bribed to testify against her. False documents appeared, and whispers of scandal spread like wildfire. Alexandra endured the storm with clenched fists and a steady gaze, knowing that Evelyn's rage was also her weakness. Yet the attacks cut deeply, forcing her to defend not only her reputation but the loyalty of those who had stood by her side. Nights were spent sleepless, poring over strategies, preparing counterattacks, and holding her fragile empire together with sheer will. It was no longer just about reclaiming what was hers. It was about survival in a battlefield where mercy was extinct. Evelyn was no longer trying to protect her empire. She was fighting to destroy Alexandra entirely. The clashes spilled beyond boardrooms and newspapers. They became personal. Alexandra began receiving anonymous threats, shadows trailing her in the streets. Men paid to intimidate her. But she had endured worse. Instead of breaking, she grew bolder, turning every attempt at sabotage into proof of Evelyn's desperation. At one press conference, when asked about the sudden hostilities, Alexandra looked directly into the cameras and said, her voice calm but cutting, "Some thrones are built on lies, and lies, no matter how golden, always collapse." The words spread like wildfire across the city, a dagger aimed straight at Evelyn's pride. That night, Evelyn smashed a glass of wine against her marble wall, her reflection in the shards revealing the truth she refused to admit. Her empire was crumbling, and the daughter she had exiled was the one tearing it down. The war had begun, and neither woman intended to surrender. The city was no longer just an audience to their feud. It had become the battlefield itself. Banks chose sides, stock markets trembled, and even the media outlets divided into camps. Those loyal to Evelyn's legacy, and those enchanted by Alexandra's meteoric rise. Boardrooms became arenas of war, each meeting a duel of contracts and cunning, every deal a weapon aimed at the other. Yet beneath the gleam of wealth and power, both women bled. Evelyn's empire began to fracture faster than she could repair it. Key allies defected to Alexandra's side, while others abandoned Harrington Industries altogether. But Alexandra, too, felt the weight of war. Her resources stretched thin, her allies overworked, and the cost of constant attacks threatened to drain everything she had built. For every victory she claimed, Evelyn struck back with venom twice as sharp. It was no longer a game of power, it was a siege, and neither woman showed mercy. The betrayal came when Alexandra least expected it. One of her closest allies, Daniel Cross, the disillusioned lawyer who had once defected from Evelyn, suddenly turned against her. He had been Evelyn's pawn all along, feeding her information while pretending to build Alexandra's trust. With his treachery, Evelyn gained access to Alexandra's strategies, her vulnerabilities, her secret acquisitions. Within weeks, Evelyn launched a counterattack that nearly annihilated Alexandra's holdings. Factories she had saved closed overnight, contracts dissolved under sudden legal pressure, and one by one, partners who had once sworn loyalty began to retreat in fear. Alexandra felt the ground crumble beneath her feet, and for the first time in years, doubt pierced her armor. She had been so careful, so deliberate. Yet Evelyn had struck where it hurt most, through betrayal from within. Alone in her office one night, staring at the empty seats around the table where her allies once gathered, Alexandra felt the cold weight of defeat pressing against her chest. But it was in that darkness that her resolve was truly tested. She remembered the night of her exile, standing in the rain with nothing but her father's memory to cling to. She had survived then, and she would survive now. Betrayal could wound her, but it could not destroy her. Rising from her desk, she summoned those who remained loyal, not with promises of glory, but with truth. She admitted her failures, acknowledged the cost of war, and vowed that if they stood with her, they would not fight for vengeance alone, but for a future worth building. Her voice trembled with exhaustion, but it carried a power that reignited the fire in their hearts. Alexandra had been betrayed, nearly broken, but she would not bow. War was blood, war was loss, but war also revealed those who truly belonged. And in that moment, Alexandra chose not to give up the fight. She chose to rise once more, sharper and stronger than before. Evelyn believed the betrayal had shattered Alexandra beyond repair. She celebrated prematurely, hosting lavish dinners in her penthouse, proclaiming her triumph to investors who forced smiles while hiding their doubts. But beneath Evelyn's golden chandeliers, cracks widened in silence. Alexandra, though wounded, had not vanished. She had retreated into the shadows once more, but this time not in exile, not in despair. She rebuilt with precision, cutting away the rot left by Daniel's treachery and fortifying her circle with those who had proven loyalty through fire. Where Evelyn flaunted false security, Alexandra forged resilience in secrecy. She shifted her strategies, moving from open confrontation to surgical strikes. Her silence became Evelyn's paranoia, her absence a presence Evelyn could not escape. Slowly, the tide turned. Investors Evelyn thought she had secured vanished overnight. Deals crumbled at the last minute, and whispers spread of Evelyn's growing instability. The queen still sat on her throne, but the cracks beneath it had grown into chasms. The decisive strike came not with violence, but with revelation. Alexandra unearthed documents Evelyn had buried years ago, proof of embezzlement, corruption, and the fraudulent signatures that had stolen the Harrington Empire from its rightful heir. With her allies in law and media, Alexandra released the evidence like a thunderclap across the city. Overnight, Evelyn's carefully curated image disintegrated. Headlines screamed betrayal, board members resigned in shame, and government investigators swarmed the empire she had built on lies. Alexandra did not stop there. She appeared on every major network, her voice steady, her eyes sharp, not as a victim, but as the embodiment of truth reclaiming its place. "My father's legacy was never meant to be a throne of deceit," she declared. "It was meant to be a foundation of honor, integrity, and vision. And today, that legacy returns to its rightful path." Her words struck like daggers, and the world cheered not just for her, but for the justice they had long awaited. Evelyn fought back with desperation, but desperation is the final act of the defeated. Her lawyers floundered, her allies fled, and her fortune evaporated under the weight of lawsuits and investigations. In her rage, she confronted Alexandra one last time, storming into her rival's office with venom dripping from every word. "You think you've won?" she spat, her eyes wild. "You've built nothing. You've only stolen what I claimed." Alexandra did not flinch. She stood tall, meeting Evelyn's gaze with a calm fire. "I didn't steal," she replied softly. "I took back what was always mine, and you, Evelyn, will be remembered not as a queen, but as the thief who created her own destruction." Evelyn's scream echoed through the marble halls as security escorted her out, her crown shattered, her empire in ruins. And in that moment, Alexandra Harrington did not just dethrone her stepmother. She reclaimed her destiny. The Harrington estate, once a graveyard of broken promises and stolen dreams, shone once more with light. Chandeliers blazed across the grand halls, marble floors gleamed, and the fountains sang again as though they too had waited for Alexandra's return. Yet the house was not the same. It was reborn, infused with the spirit of its rightful heir. Alexandra stood in her father's old study, her hands resting on the desk where his wisdom had once guided her. 8 years had passed since she had been cast out into the rain, stripped of everything, humiliated and forgotten. Now, she stood not as the discarded daughter, but as the woman who had turned exile into empire, betrayal into strength, and pain into power. The air felt different, as though even the walls recognized her. She had not only reclaimed her father's legacy, she had carved her own. But Alexandra's victory was not without scars. She carried the memory of hunger, of nights spent trembling on benches, of friends lost to betrayal and battles that nearly broke her. These scars did not weaken her, they became her armor. Looking out the tall windows over the city skyline, she understood a truth Evelyn never had. Power was not about possession, it was about purpose. The empire she now held would not be ruled by greed or fear, but by vision and integrity. Around her stood the allies who had endured with her, each one a reminder that loyalty could not be bought, only earned. Alexandra raised a glass in their honor, her voice steady, her eyes fierce. "This is not just my victory," she said. "It is proof that no betrayal, no exile, no cruelty can destroy what is destined to rise again." And so, the tale of Alexandra Harrington closed not with vengeance, but with wisdom. She had dethroned Evelyn, yes, but the true triumph was in her transformation. From victim to warrior, from exile to queen. Her story was a lesson carved in fire and stone. That when life strips you of everything, you are given the chance to rebuild yourself into something unbreakable. Do not fear the storm, become it. Do not surrender to the shadows, rise through them. Alexandra's voice lingered in the hearts of all who heard her, echoing a truth that could not be silenced. Never allow betrayal to define your ending. Let it fuel your beginning. Backhand index pointing right if you were moved by Alexandra's journey. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Stories like this remind us that no matter how deep the fall, the rise can be even greater. Rose Fire.